was the conference. Have you had any highlights from the afternoon's sessions?
I think, the session I was involved with was interesting to hear different perspectives than the ones before also. I think the industry finds itself at an interesting time because there's obviously quite a lot of activity going on, and as the president of AC was saying at the end there's order books are looking good, but there's quite a lot of nervousness around Brexit, around US elections, around the general health of Europe. And so that kind of sort of sense of we're okay now, but there are things on the horizon that we need to be thinking about, sort of came across quite strongly. And I think that's absolutely right. And it's not unique to this industry, but there was a real sense of that and quite a lot of interesting thought being put into that.
It's interesting you mentioned sort of the worries ahead. One of the analyses that have come out of the recent period has been this idea that we're in sort of a post-truth world where technical experts don't matter. Is this a particular threat to consultants, do you think? I know you sort of work in sort of security consultancy, that kind of thing. Do you feel the threat, and should engineers feel a similar threat? Or
I think for engineers the sort of truth is important. I'm married to a civil engineer, and so if I know that if the truth of whether a building is going to stand up or not is kind of important, and so post-truth in engineering I think is probably we're not ready for that yet. To my mind, that plays largely in the political sphere rather than in the professional sphere, and we are in an extraordinary age where people get their news, this is generalization, but a lot of people get their news from news outlets that they agree with and that reinforce their own opinions, and they're increasingly exposed to very extreme political views, whether that be talk radio, particularly in the US, but also here in the United Kingdom, and news outlets that quite often preach a mantra of everything's going to the dogs. The campaign slogan that President-elect Trump had, "Make America Great Again," a lot of people argue that the US is doing quite well. Unemployment is low, the economy is growing again, militarily the US is unchallenged globally, but the constant repetition of negative messages, people start to believe them. So I don't think for consultants and engineers in the professional sphere we're in the post-truth world, but I think in the political sphere we are, and it's I think unnerving, particularly for people who spend a lot of time thinking through and analysing and focusing on trying to get to the truth. It's rather disconcerting to be told either we've heard enough of experts or that expertise doesn't matter anymore.
Now, you mentioned the rise of Donald Trump in the States, which was a big part of the session that we just heard. And I guess the big fear for the international community, I suppose, is that the US will feel more protectionist, more insular, will be more inward-looking. What do you see as the major risks for sort of international trade, and who do you think might emerge from that sort of power vacuum?
It's, what are we? We're sort of 48 hours on, if that, from an election result, and we don't yet know who will make up the Trump administration in terms of beyond himself. And so anything we say is speculation. I guess one can be fairly confident that new President Trump will focus on infrastructure. He made that clear in his acceptance speech. In terms of a way of bringing jobs to his blue-collar heartland voters, that is probably the easiest way, because trying to get manufacturing back to the United States is difficult. The administration is going to have a challenge in terms of how does it fund that, because he's also committed to tax cuts, and he will have a Republican Congress that is quite keen on tax cuts. Infrastructure costs money. Does he raise the debt ceiling? Who buys American debt? Quite often that's China. At the same time, he's certainly in his political rhetoric being quite clear on his view that the Chinese are doing some things that are very damaging to the American economy. I remember from reading Tony Blair's autobiography, not for many people necessarily a sort of huge political guidebook, but a really interesting book when he said, and a particular bit where he said, it's very easy to be in opposition, and it's very easy to point out things that are wrong, and actually when you arrive with a full in tray, as he will as president, he's going to find that actually administering, and I'm sure he knows it, but actually running an administration requires trade-offs, and it requires, to a certain extent, having to modify some of the things he promised, and in some things he promised there are inherent contradictions. I've given you what is a very vague answer, because at the moment it's very difficult to be clear. There are things we think that the new president will focus on. He will focus on infrastructure. We believe he will look to reduce a lot of regulation on US industry, particularly favourable to oil and gas. Some of those things he can do because President Obama has enacted some of that through executive decree, and it is easy, therefore, for the president to reverse a presidential executive decree. Some of the other things he wants to do require the approval of Congress, and bear in mind that whilst he's a Republican, he by no means has the full support around everything he has said from the Republican Party. In fact, far from it.
Final question.
Yeah.
We've been talking about these huge debates about global markets, big political changes in the world. And I think among the audience today, CEOs, it is top of their agenda. But to what extent do you think these concerns trickle down to the rest of the organisation? And is there more that we can do to ensure that companies as a whole have an appreciation of these kind of topics?
So I'm probably in a poor position to answer that, because I work in a company, Control Risk, that lives and breathes international relations on a daily basis, and I'm constantly talking to my colleagues about this. So in my world, everybody's thinking about it, but your point is well made. Not everybody is. I think the Brexit result in the United Kingdom, particularly for those of us who work in big cities, here we are in London, I have lots of colleagues from all over the world, and that at a lot of levels in companies was a very personal thing. The US presidential campaign has been an extraordinary theatre, and people have been remarkably engaged. My children, even my 11-year-old, has been following the US presidential election. So people are, I think, probably more engaged than we think about it. And actually, for, I guess, all leaders in companies, it's probably important, it is important for us to explain what we think these things mean. And we're not always going to be right, but I believe companies, people at all levels are interested, and that has been one of the effects of globalization, that people are very aware we live in a very interconnected world.